The letter arrived on a Thursday. Muriel did not open it herself. She was not permitted to. Her stepmother plucked it from the salver with 2 fingers as if it smelled, examined the seal with narrowed eyes, and then set it down beside the breakfast plate she had never been invited to share. "It is an offer," stepmother said. "A serious one." Muriel stood in the doorway in her second-best dress, the gray one, the one she wore when she was expected to be invisible, and said nothing. "You will accept," her stepmother said, lifting her tea. "You have no other prospects, and your father's will is quite clear on what happens to this house should you remain unmarried past 25, which," she added without looking up, "is in 6 weeks." Muriel looked at the letter. She looked at the seal pressed into the wax. A hawk mid-strike, wings folded for the kill. She had heard of the Duke of Varn. Everyone had. A man who did not attend balls, did not tolerate sentiment, and had buried 2 fiancées, not literally. Both had simply fled the engagement and later married happier men. London called him the Hawk. Not for his title's crest, for what he did to people who disappointed him. "You will accept," stepmother said again. Muriel picked up the letter, unfolded it, and read it twice. Then she looked up and said, quite calmly, "All right, but I have a condition." Her stepmother laughed. She should not have done that. Before we follow Muriel into that negotiation, and I promise you it is worth following, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and stay with this story until the very end. This tale is written for every woman who has ever been laughed at in a room that underestimated her. Drop a comment below with the city you are watching from tonight. I want to see how far Marie's story reaches. Now, let us go back to the moment her stepmother stopped laughing. To understand why Marie Voss stood in that doorway with a condition rather than a curtsy, you have to understand what the previous 5 years had made her. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been a man of moderate means and immoderate warmth, a solicitor who read poetry and kept bees and believed, genuinely believed, that the world rewarded goodness if you were patient enough. He had married twice, the first time for love, and that had given him Muriel. The second time for loneliness, 3 years after her mother died, and that had given him Cecily Pratt, now Cecily Voss, and 2 daughters of Cecily's own blood. When Edmund died, Muriel was 19. The will he left was generous in intention and fatal in its specifics. The house, the income, the small but decent Voss estate in Wiltshire, all of it held in trust until Muriel married. If she had not married by 25, control transferred permanently to Cecily, and Muriel received only a modest annuity that would not have kept a respectable woman in gloves. Edmund had written this believing it would protect his daughter. He had not considered what happened to a daughter left in the care of a woman who understood with cold clarity that her own comfort depended on that daughter not marrying well. The years that followed were a careful education in smallness. Muriel's gowns were always 1 season behind. Her invitations were declined on her behalf when a better prospect arose for either stepsister. When a young man showed interest in her at a subscription concert, Cecily seated herself between them and talked until he left. When another wrote to the house, Cecily replied on Marie's behalf, expressing indifference. What Cecily did not count on was that Marie had her father's patience and her mother's mind, and she had spent those 5 years watching, recording, learning the precise mechanics of how her stepmother operated. She had read the will herself. She had spoken quietly with her father's old solicitor, Mr. Farrow, on 3 separate occasions. She knew exactly what she was owed, and she knew exactly what she needed to claim it. She needed a husband willing to marry quickly, ask few questions, and not flinch at a woman who arrived with complications. The Duke of Varn, Callum Ashby, 34 years old, $12,000 a year, with a reputation cold enough to frost glass, had been recommended to her by Mr. Farrow in oblique but unmistakable terms. His Grace has recently experienced a reversal of personal circumstance, Farrow had said, adjusting his spectacles, which has made him amenable to arrangements that might have previously been beneath his consideration. In other words, the Duke needed money he could not ask for openly, and Muriel needed a title she could use as a shield. Now, the Duke, Callum Ashby, had not chosen coldness. It had been chosen for him by increments, over 15 years of being performed at. He had inherited the Varn title at 22, young enough that people could not quite tell him apart from it. Women wanted the dukedom. Men wanted the connections. His own family, a sprawling, genteel network of cousins, wanted the patronage. Every conversation he had walked into for more than a decade had contained, somewhere in its architecture, a want he was expected to satisfy without being thanked. He had learned to hear it. The slight elevation in warmth when the topic turned to favor, the way a woman's eyes went slightly unfocused when she was calculating rather than listening. He had been engaged once, at 26, to a viscount's daughter named Helena, who had cried beautifully at the announcement party, and then, 6 weeks later, eloped with a cavalry officer. Callum had not been heartbroken. He had been unsurprised, which was almost worse. It confirmed what he had already suspected, that people showed him what they wanted him to see, and the real thing lived somewhere he could not reach. What had cracked him more recently was quieter and more permanent. His younger brother Gerard had borrowed against the Varn name for 3 years without Callum's knowledge. A succession of bad investments, gambling hells, and a moneylender in Cheapside who had finally presented the accumulated debt with the kind of smile that precedes a scandal. The sum was not ruinous on its own, but the manner of its revelation was. It had come out in a solicitor's office, in front of witnesses, and within a fortnight every club in London knew the Duke of Varn had been living above his actual means. The talk was not loud. Talk about dukes never was, but it was there, underneath the surfaces, and Callum could feel it the way you feel, a splinter you cannot find to remove. He needed to settle the debt quietly and quickly. He needed a transaction that looked like a marriage, would be treated socially as one, and would cost him as little of himself as possible. Enter Mr. Farrow, who had been solicitor to the Voss family for 30 years, and who had, apparently, a talent for connecting people who needed each other. They met at Farrow's offices on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, which struck Marie as the correct kind of day for a business meeting disguised as something else. Gray sky, practical light, no illusions. She arrived first, which she had planned. She wanted to be seated when he walked in. She wanted him to have to cross the room to her. He was taller than she had expected, not dramatically, simply tall, with the kind of composed stillness that suggested he had trained himself not to let his body react before his mind had made a decision. Dark hair, close cut, a jaw that looked like it had decided something. He wore gray, which she noted with private amusement. They had both, independently, dressed for business. He looked at her the way she had expected him to, with the careful neutrality of a man who had been surprised before and had learned to protect himself against a second surprise by refusing to have a first impression at all. She stood, extended her hand. "Your Grace, I am Mireille Voss." He shook it. "I know." His voice was lower than she'd pictured it, and more direct. No ornament in it. They sat. Mr. Farrow spread his papers. The terms were straightforward. Marie's inheritance trust, which held the Voss estate and its annual income, required a husband's legal co-signature to be unlocked. Upon marriage, Callum would receive an immediate settlement that would retire Gerard's debt with discretion, and an annual income from the trust that would restore the Varn finances to comfortable solidity. Mireille would receive the title, the legal protection of the marriage, and whatever domestic autonomy Callum was prepared to extend. "The arrangement can be managed quietly," Farrow said. "A small ceremony. The settlement transferred before the week is out." There was a pause. Callum looked at Mireille. "You said you had a condition." "I did," she said, "and I still do." Farrow cleared his throat. Callum waited. "I want the East Wing," she said, "of Varn House. It has been closed for 11 years. I want it opened, given a proper staff allocation, and treated as my household to manage as I see fit. I will not ask you for access to your spaces. I will not require your company at meals unless you choose it. I will conduct myself as your Duchess in public without complaint." She folded her hands. But I will not live in a man's house as a guest in my own marriage. I want ground that is mine." The room was quiet. Callum studied her for a long moment. She let him. She had learned not to fill silences she hadn't earned. "Why the East Wing specifically?" he asked. "Because the account book suggests it has the best light and the worst drains, which means no one will fight me for it. And I'll have a project that will tell me everything I need to know about how you run your estate." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, maybe. The memory of what a smile had once felt like. "Agreed," he said. Mireille nodded. "Then we have a contract." "We have a contract," he confirmed, and looked at her for 1 second longer than he needed to. She noticed. She did not let him see that she noticed. They were married 11 days later, in a small church in Marylebone, with Pharaoh and Callum's man Peyton as witnesses, and Marie's old governess, Mrs. Birch, who wept quietly into a handkerchief and called it hay fever. Callum did not look at her during the vows. Marie looked at him throughout. Not warmly, not coldly. The way you look at a document you intend to read very carefully. Varn House was exactly as she had expected. Magnificent, suffocating, and wrong in the way that houses are wrong when no one has lived in them fully for a long time. Grand rooms with shut curtains, staff who moved efficiently and spoke to no one, and order to everything that had the flavor of a man who controlled his environment because he could not control what had happened to him. The East Wing was worse. Mireille stood in the main East Room on her first morning and looked at the covered furniture, the damp that had crept up the far wall, the windows so thickly curtained she could not tell if it was morning or afternoon. She pulled the nearest curtain down herself. No ceremony, just a firm grip and her full weight, and let the October light in. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davils, appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace," she said in the tone of someone who had not expected this. "Good morning," Mireille said, looking at the damp. "Who do I speak to about the drainage under this wing?" "His Grace oversees all structural matters personally. Then I'll need to speak to His Grace." That evening, she knocked on the door of Callum's study. He looked up from a ledger, not startled, but not having expected her either. She laid her findings on his desk, a brief list in her clear handwriting. 3 drainage points, 1 window frame rotting at the base, a gap in the roof above the servants' stairs she had located by the cold air coming through. He looked at the list, then at her. "You did this today?" "I had time. Most women would have spent it arranging flowers. I have no flowers yet," she said. "They're coming Thursday." He almost smiled again. She was beginning to recognize the signs. The very slight loosening at the corners of his eyes. A breath that was half a sound. "I'll have the estate manager speak with you in the morning," he said. "Thank you." She retrieved her list, turned to go, then paused at the door. "The ledger you're working from is last year's. There's a newer one. Your secretary left it in the hall table drawer. The figures on page 14 are different." She left before he could answer. The estate manager's name was Prewitt, and he was a careful man who had learned to be careful by working for a careful duke. He received Marie with the cautious deference of someone who had not yet decided how much authority she actually had. She showed him the drainage issue. She showed him the rot in the window frame. She asked about the household accounts for the East Wing's maintenance, and listened while he explained that the wing had no budget allocation because it had been deemed unoccupied. "Allocate it now," she said pleasantly. "The figures are straightforward. I'll bring you the numbers by Wednesday." She brought him the numbers by Tuesday. Callum heard about this from Prewitt, who mentioned it in a passing comment about the East Wing repairs that had been authorized with unexpected efficiency. He said nothing, but that evening at dinner, they had begun to take dinner together, not by agreement, but by the coincidence of both being hungry at the same hour. He looked at her across the table and said, "Where did you learn accounting?" "My father was a solicitor," she said. "He taught me to read a balance sheet before I was 12. He thought it was more useful than embroidery." He was right. He usually was, she said. There was something in her voice when she said it. A softness that was not performed, that slipped out briefly before she collected it. the kind of softness that only emerges when someone was genuinely loved and genuinely lost. Callum looked at his plate. "My father was not usually right," he said, after a pause. "He was occasionally spectacular and frequently catastrophic, in that particular combination some men have." Mireille looked at him. "Is that why the estate was struggling?" "No." He reached for his wine. "That was Gerard." She did not push. She had noticed by now that he gave information in specific quantities. Enough to answer the question asked, rarely a word more. She found this against her expectation, not frustrating, but clarifying. When Callum Ashby said something, it was because he had decided to say it. There was no excess in him. 2 weeks into their marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon, she was in the East Wing's smaller parlor, now repaired, now warm, now properly lit. When she heard the piano, she had not known there was a piano. Varn House was the sort of house that had room for things you did not discover immediately. She followed the sound through 2 corridors and a half-open door to a music room on the East Wing's opposite side, a room she had not yet reached in her inventory of the space. Callum was at the piano. He was not performing. He was playing with the focused, slightly unhurried quality of a man doing something that had no audience in it, that he had done so long it was part of the architecture of him. Something slow. Something in a minor key that felt like a question being asked into an empty room. She should have left. She knew she should have. She stood in the doorway and listened until the piece finished. He did not startle when he finally turned. He had heard the door. "You found the room," he said. "I wasn't trying to spy." "I know. You would have been more subtle if you were." He moved slightly on the bench. "Sit, if you like." She sat in the chair by the window rather than beside him on the bench. Distance, for now, felt correct. "What was that piece?" she asked. "My mother's." She composed it. He looked at the keys. "She died when I was 17. I keep the piece because it is the most honest version of what this house used to feel like." Maria was quiet for a moment. What did it feel like? Like it still had a center. He said it simply, without decoration, and that was what made it land. She was the person the house organized itself around. When she was gone, it just became a building. "That's what happened to the East Wing," Muriel said. "Someone stopped inhabiting it, so it became storage." He looked at her. "Is that what you're doing? Inhabiting it?" "I'm trying to." Another pause. Outside, a cart passed in the street, and the sound of London going about its business drifted faintly through the glass. "You are not what I expected," Callum said. "Not as a compliment, as a statement of observed fact." "I know," Muriel said. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to ignore." She did not say the obvious thing that had been, in fact, her stepmother's entire strategy for 5 years. She said instead, "Is that what you wanted?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, "I thought it was." She left him with that. She went back to the East Wing and sat for a while in the parlor that was beginning, slowly, to feel like hers. And she thought about a man who had turned a house into a fortress and did not know how to live in it anymore. She thought about it more than she had planned to. 3 days later, one of Marie's stepsisters arrived at Varn House without an invitation. Dorothea Pratt, the elder of Cecily's daughters. 22, ambitious, and possessed of the particular social gift of making her presence feel inevitable, presented herself at the door in the early afternoon and asked to see her dear sister. The butler, a man named Graves, who had served the Varn household for 20 years and had consequently developed the instincts of a seasoned diplomat, sent word upstairs. Muriel came down. "Dorothea," she said, at the top of the stairs. "Muriel, darling." Dorothea's embrace was the kind that holds on a moment too long. "Mama wanted me to come. She's been so worried. You married so suddenly, we barely had time to—" "Come in," Muriel said. "Graves, tea in the East Parlor, please." She took Dorothea to the East Wing. Not to the main reception rooms, those were Callum's. The East Parlor was hers, with its good light and its repaired fireplace, and she sat across from her stepsister and folded her hands and waited. "You look well," Dorothea said, with the slight tone of someone who had hoped otherwise. "I am well," Mireille said. "So the Duke, is he they say he is quite. He is exactly as he needs to be." Dorothea tried several more approaches over the next 20 minutes, each one a slightly different angle on the same probe. Was Mireille unhappy? Was the Duke cold? Did she feel trapped? Was she sure, quite sure, the arrangement had been the right decision? Mama had been thinking about the Wiltshire property and whether Mireille had had proper time to consider. The Wiltshire property, Mireille said, is mine. It was always mine. You know this, Dorothea. Of course, Dorothea said, smiling thinly. We all do. Good. Mireille stood. Tell your mother. I'll write next week. I have rather a lot on at present. She walked Dorothea to the door herself. Graves held it open. On the step, Dorothea turned one final time. I do hope he's kind to you, Mireille. A man like that. You never quite know, do you? A man like what? Marie asked. Dorothea smiled and left without answering. Mireille stood at the closed door for a moment. Then she went back inside, nodded at Graves, who had the particular expression of a man who had seen a great deal and would say none of it, and went upstairs to find she had, without meaning to, arrived at the door of Callum's study. She did not knock immediately. She stood there and thought about what Dorothea had done, which was the thing Dorothea always did. Plant doubt like a seed and walk away before you could pull it out. You're not going to knock? Callum said from inside. She pushed the door open. I didn't realize you could hear me standing there. Old houses carry sound. He had put down his pen. What's happened? She sat without being invited to and told him about the visit. Not with drama, just the facts of it, in order, with her assessments in the appropriate places. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he always listened. Your stepmother sent her to take your temperature, he said when she had finished.
Yes. She's worried you're settled.
Yes. Are you? He asked it without inflection. It was a real question. Mireille considered it honestly. I think I'm becoming settled, she said, which surprised me. He did not answer immediately. Then it surprises me as well. She looked at him. He was looking at his desk. That same quality she'd seen at the piano. Not closed, but careful. A man who had learned that wanting things created the risk of losing them, and had not yet found his way to trusting the want. For what it's worth, she said, standing, you are not what I expected either. What did you expect? He asked. A mirror of her earlier question. Someone easier to dismiss, she said, and left him with that. 3 weeks after the wedding, at a supper at Lord Peyton's house, to which they had gone together for the first time as a public couple, Marie found herself seated next to a woman named Lady Rosalind Ferrers, who was 60, sharp-eyed, and had apparently known Callum since he was a boy. She was pleasant company. She talked about Callum at 12 years old riding a horse that was too large for him and refusing to admit it. She talked about his mother, Margaret Ashby, whom she had loved. She said, in the comfortable manner of someone who did not intend cruelty, I'm so glad he's finally chosen someone with sense. The last woman who tried to get close to him didn't understand that the distance isn't spite. It's fear. Mireille smiled and moved the conversation on. But on the carriage ride home, she thought about it. She thought about the piano in the East Wing and the piece his mother had composed. She thought about the ledgers he kept himself rather than delegating. She thought about how he had looked in those first days at every small thing she did that was not what he had expected, like a man who had forgotten that surprise could be neutral rather than threatening. She thought, he is afraid I will leave. And then, with a precision she had not braced herself for, she thought, I don't want to leave. She sat with that for the rest of the drive and said nothing. The rupture came 2 days later, and it came from Dorothea. Not directly. Dorothea was her mother's daughter, and Cecily operated through intermediaries. What arrived was a letter, not to Mireille, to Callum. She did not know its contents until that evening, when she came to dinner and found him already seated, the letter on the table beside him, His face closed in a way it had not been closed for some time. "A letter came today," he said, "from your stepmother's solicitor." She sat. "What does it say?" He turned it to face her. It was a formal document, carefully worded, drawing Callum's attention to a clause in the original Voss Trust that had apparently been overlooked in the arrangement. A clause stating that if the marriage had been contracted under material misrepresentation, the trust could be contested and the settlement reversed. Cecily's solicitor was suggesting, with considerable delicacy, that there had been certain facts about Mireille's situation which she had not disclosed to her husband before the contract was signed. Callum's voice was even. "Were there?" Mireille felt the ground shift under her. Not because she had not lied, but because there were things she had not said, and she could see in his face that she was being asked to account for the distance between those two things. "There were things I did not tell you," she said, which was true. "What things?" She took a breath. "Mr. Farrow came to me first. Not to you. I asked him to approach you rather than going through the standard channels because I needed someone who would not vet me in the way that the open market would have vetted me. My stepmother had spent 5 years ensuring that any man who showed interest in me was managed away from it. If I had gone through normal means, she would have found out before it was final and intervened." She met his eyes. "I needed it to happen quickly and quietly. Farrow knew that. He arranged it accordingly." "You directed the arrangement." "Yes. You chose me. I chose you as a practical solution to a specific problem." "Yes." She paused. "That is not all I think of you now. But that is how it began." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent life. "I was not honest with you about my stepmother's involvement," she said. "Not because I meant to deceive you. Because I knew that if I told you the full shape of it, you would have questioned the arrangement's integrity and it might have fallen apart. I told myself it didn't matter because the terms were fair." She folded her hands on the table. "But it wasn't only mine to decide." He was looking at her with the expression she had learned meant he was thinking rather than reacting. She had come to value that about him. It was one of the things she had not expected. "This clause," he said finally, picking up the solicitor's letter. "Is it real? I don't know. Possibly. My stepmother is resourceful." She paused. "If she contests the settlement, what happens? Litigation. Months of it. Possibly a recovery of part of what was transferred." He set the letter down. "It would not ruin me. It would embarrass me." Mireille was quiet. "That is what she's counting on," he said. Not angrily, with the cool clarity of a man who had been maneuvered before and recognized the shape of it. "She doesn't expect to win. She expects the threat to be enough." "Enough for what?" "To make me want to be rid of you." The words landed plainly in the room. Mireille raised her chin. "And do you?" The pause was brief, but it was there. "I don't know yet what I'm angry about," he said. "I need to think." She stood. "That's fair," she said, and left. She went to the East Wing. She sat in her parlor in the dark for a long time, not lighting a candle, and she felt the specific loneliness of being in a place you had begun to love and not knowing if it would hold you. She had done what she always did. She had managed the situation. She had been practical. She had protected her outcome. And she had, in doing so, given someone who was afraid of being managed exactly the evidence he needed to be afraid. She pressed her fingers to the arm of the chair. The wood was solid under her hands. The repairs she had ordered had held. She thought, "I should have told him earlier." She thought, "I was afraid he would walk away if I did." She thought, "I have become the thing he was afraid of." She sat with that for a long time. It was past 11 when she heard the knock. She had lit a single candle by then. The parlor was small and warm, and the knock was quiet, the knock of someone who was not certain they had the right to make it. "Come in," she said. Callum opened the door. He stood in it for a moment, looking at the room, at the order she had made of it, the books on the shelf she had brought from Wiltshire, the small portrait of her father she had hung above the mantelpiece. And then he came in and sat in the chair across from her. He looked tired. Not broken, just a man who had been thinking very hard and had arrived somewhere. I spoke to Farrell this evening, he said. By letter. He paused. He confirmed your account. He also told me something you likely didn't know he was going to say, which is that he approached you on my brother's recommendation. Gerard knew you were in a difficult position. He thought you'd suit each other. He looked at his hands. Gerard was apparently playing matchmaker from inside his own catastrophe. Mireille absorbed this. I didn't know that, she said. I know you didn't. He looked up. I am not angry at you for directing the arrangement. I directed my side of it. We both had things we needed and found a way to obtain them. He stopped. What I still mind a little, is that you didn't trust me enough to tell me your stepmother was a threat. Not to the contract. To you. She looked at him. You've been managing this alone, he said, for 5 years. I understand why. I have seen your stepmother's methods, even from a distance, and I understand precisely why you learned to move quietly and tell no one more than they needed to know. But I am your husband, and I am not the enemy. He said it quietly and with the deliberate weight of a man who had chosen every word. I would like, if you will let me, to be someone you tell things to. Mireille felt something loosen in her chest, the specific tightness that comes from carrying weight for so long you have forgotten it is not simply your normal posture. I have not had much practice at that, she said. I know. A pause. Neither have I. She looked at him across the candlelit room. This careful, wounded, unexpectedly decent man she had chosen as a practical solution and had found to her considerable inconvenience was something much more than that. I should have told you earlier, she said. I was afraid you would decide I was too complicated. You are complicated, he said. I find I don't mind it. He met her eyes. I am not an easy man to be married to. I know that. I have been controlling this house like a problem to be solved, rather than a place to be lived in, and I have done the same with every relationship in it. You walked into the East Wing and opened the curtains and brought in light without asking whether the room wanted it. I noticed, she said. I wasn't sure if you appreciated it. I didn't, he said honestly, at first. And then I did. He reached across the table between them, not taking her hand but resting his own beside it. Close, available, not demanding. I would like to start again. Not the marriage. The honesty inside it. Mireille looked at his hand beside hers. Then she turned her hand over and let it rest in his. Start again, she said. All right. As for Cecily Pratt's legal challenge, it failed. Mr. Farrell and Callum's own solicitors examined the clause in question and established with some thoroughness that it contained no applicable grounds. The settlement stood. The Voss estate in Wiltshire was formally transferred to Mireille's legal control the following spring. Cecily withdrew from London society 6 months later, not dramatically, not with scandal, but with the quiet diminishment of a woman whose influence had depended entirely on one household she no longer had access to. She moved her daughters to a house in Bath, where Dorothea eventually made a respectable marriage to a linen merchant, who did not know enough about titles to be disappointed by the lack of them. Mireille was told this by Mrs. Birch, who had kept contact with the old household and reported news and letters with the determined innocence of someone who was absolutely not gossiping. It seems right, Mireille said, putting the letter down. It seems quiet, Callum said from across the breakfast table. He had developed a habit of reading with her in the mornings, each in their own chair, in the east parlor that had long since ceased to feel like only hers, which is generally more durable than right. She looked at him over her coffee. That is a very practical thing to say. I learned from someone, she smiled. The East Wing had been fully restored by the end of their first winter. The music room had a new stool for the piano. The garden at the back, which had been a tangle of overgrown rose canes when Mireille arrived, was now properly managed, and bloomed in the spring with the enthusiastic disorder of something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. They had a daughter, born in the 2nd year of the marriage, with Callum's dark hair and Marie's eyes. They named her Margaret. On a Sunday afternoon, a year into Margaret's life, Muriel was sitting in the east parlor with the account she had now taken over entirely. Prewitt had been relieved, in a way he would not admit, to no longer be the sole keeper of Varnhouse's books. When Callum came in from the garden with their daughter balanced on his hip and soil on his coat, and the particular expression he wore when he had been at something he found absorbing. "There's a bloom on the old rose cane by the east wall," he said. "First one in years. Margaret found it." Margaret, who was 14 months old and had opinions about everything, pointed at the window as if confirming this. Muriel looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the open curtains and the garden coming through the glass. She thought about the gray dress, the letter she had been handed like a problem to be assigned rather than a life to be lived, the room she had walked into with her full weight and pulled the curtains down and let the light in. She thought, "I came here to survive. I stayed because it became worth staying in. Is there enough bloom for cutting?" she asked. "One," Callum said, and held it out to her. "Perhaps you have known what Marie knew, the particular weariness of being managed away from your own life, of being made to feel complicated, difficult, too much, not because you were any of those things, but because someone near you found it useful to believe they were. Perhaps you have learned to carry things quietly, tell no one more than they needed, and keep your own counsel because the cost of trusting was too uncertain and the cost of being wrong too high. And perhaps, like Muriel, you have sometimes wondered if a life like hers, chosen with clear eyes, built with your own hands, honest about its origins, and lovelier than it had any right to be, is something you are allowed to have. You are. The people who taught you to be small were wrong. The right place will hold you. The right person will not ask you to be less. And the rooms you walk into with your full weight, those rooms belong to you. If this story found something real in you tonight, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from. This channel reaches people I never expected, in cities I've never been to, and every name reminds me why these stories matter. Share this with someone who has been waiting too long to take up space. And to you, watching right now, you are not too complicated. You are not too much. You have always been exactly enough.